Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
They always had this way of making you feel like a guest in your own life, polite, cordial, pleasant even, but distant, like your presence was appreciated, though never necessary. That night was no different. The house smelled like memories I never asked for: roast beef with overcooked carrots, store-bought cake pretending to be homemade, perfume lingering in the hallway that my mother had worn since before I had breasts. The living room, decked out in dollar store streamers and gold balloons shaped like the number 40, buzzed with small talk and shallow laughter. And there I stood, holding a tray of champagne flutes like some invisible waitress, smiling at people I hadn't seen since the Bush administration. My sister, Sarah, floated through the crowd in a wine-colored dress she probably bought just for the photos, her 3 kids orbiting her like little planets desperate for attention. She always looked tired, but somehow radiant, like motherhood gave her purpose and a light I could never fake. My brother, Mark, stood by the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other resting casually on the shoulder of his latest wife. I'd stopped counting after the second one. He had that smug, self-assured glow that only men with God complexes and Ivy League diplomas can maintain past 40. And then there was me, Amanda, child number 3, family footnote, the one who answered every call at 2 in the morning when mom's blood sugar dropped or when dad got confused and wandered out during one of his silent spells. The one who stayed. They told me it meant something back then. Staying. Sacrificing. Being responsible. Putting others first. They told me it mattered. But as I watched my father raise his glass and look across the room, pride practically dripping from his voice as he said, "To the children who made us proud," I realized it had never mattered at all. He said Mark's name first, his voice booming with the kind of joy he usually reserved for football games and barbecue. Then he turned to Sarah and said something about her strength and her beautiful family and how she made motherhood look effortless. The applause came easy. The smiles came easy. I waited. Not for the applause, just for the recognition. A nod. A glance. Anything. But it never came. The toast ended. Everyone clinked glasses, laughed, drank. I stood still, holding a champagne flute I hadn't touched, and swallowed a bitterness that tasted exactly like being 16 again. I didn't cry. Not then. I walked into the kitchen, loaded the dishwasher while people I used to know danced to Fleetwood Mac and pretended we all belonged. No one noticed. I wiped down the counter, picked up my keys from the bowl near the door, and said goodbye to no one in particular. As I walked out into the cool night air, the crickets felt louder than the people inside. The gravel crunched beneath my boots like it had every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every unremarkable visit when I showed up, helped out, and quietly left. I drove for hours. Didn't have a destination, just needed to get far enough away that my hands stopped shaking on the wheel. I remember pulling over on the side of a deserted 2-lane road somewhere between my hometown and whatever counted as freedom, just to breathe, just to scream inside my head without anyone telling me I was overreacting. The stars were dim that night, like they didn't have the energy to shine for someone like me. That's when my phone lit up. One message. My father's name. "You left something behind." Mom's been in tears ever since. At first, I laughed. Out loud. In the middle of nowhere, under a sky that didn't care, I laughed so hard I almost choked. What could I have possibly left behind that would make my mother cry? A casserole dish? My toothbrush? Maybe a piece of my dignity on the living room floor? I checked the back seat. Nothing. I opened my purse. Phone, wallet, keys, old receipts, a half-melted lip balm, everything accounted for. I read the message again. "You left something behind." It wasn't what he said that got me. It was the way he said it. Like I was supposed to know. Like it wasn't physical. Like it had been deliberate. I typed back, "What exactly did I leave?" and hit send. No reply. The engine hummed as I sat there in the dark, phone in my lap, heart in my throat. I don't know why I kept checking the mirror, like maybe I expected to see something following me, not a car, but a feeling, a shadow, the weight of everything I'd buried over the years rising up to finally make me look it in the eye. A message came in the next morning. This time from Sarah. "You should have stayed for dessert. He was gonna toast you too." Bullshit. He wasn't going to toast me. He forgot me. Or worse, he remembered and chose not to. Either way, the silence was intentional. You can't untoast someone. That's the thing about words, once they're out, they either heal or they haunt. His did both. And I wasn't interested in sticking around for some half-hearted, guilt-laced afterthought. I'd been an afterthought my entire life. That night wasn't the beginning of my pain, it was the end of my patience. But that message, you left something behind. It hung in my chest like a ghost I couldn't shake. Because suddenly, I wasn't so sure he meant an object. And if it wasn't physical, then what the hell did I leave behind? Something wasn't right. My mother, the same woman who once told me I was too emotional to be taken seriously, was now crying over my absence? My father, the man who once said he respected my independence, but never once visited the apartment I worked 3 jobs to afford, suddenly cared enough to text. No, there was something else going on. Something I'd never been told. Something they never meant for me to find. And the thing about secrets? Once you realize there's one, the silence starts screaming. It's a strange kind of ache, the one that doesn't come from a wound or an insult or even a betrayal in the traditional sense, but from the slow, quiet unraveling of the illusion that you ever truly mattered to the people who shaped your world. That morning, I woke up in a cheap motel off Route 94 with the TV still on, some infomercial about nonstick pans babbling in the background while I stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line I couldn't come back from. The sheets smelled like bleach and disappointment, and my phone, now sitting face down on the plastic nightstand, was the only thing in that room more exhausted than I was. I didn't go home. Not yet. The idea of walking into my apartment, throwing my keys in the bowl, and pretending like nothing happened felt almost offensive. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my jeans from the night before, and stared at the message again. You left something behind. Mom's been in tears ever since. That single line had more weight than any of my mother's holiday hugs or my father's grunts of approval combined, and yet I couldn't tell if it was manipulative or genuine, or both at once. That's the thing about families, they can wound you in ways that feel like affection and abandon you while telling you they love you. I sent the reply, what exactly did I leave? No answer. The little gray bubbles didn't even appear. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred and then tossed the phone back onto the nightstand like it had betrayed me personally. I stood under the motel shower for 20 minutes, letting the water pound against my back as if it could scrub off the years of being overlooked, dismissed, categorized as difficult just because I wasn't willing to shrink myself into the version of a daughter they could show off. I was the reliable one, the dependable one, the one who canceled plans, postponed trips, skipped dates, and delayed promotions because someone had to be there when Mom was too weak to walk to the bathroom, when Dad forgot how to start the lawnmower, when bills went unpaid or pills got mixed up or someone needed to talk through another one of Sarah's latest emotional breakdowns. And yet, despite all that, when the moment came, the one that was supposed to be for all of us, I wasn't even a footnote. Not even a mention. Like I was just air. I drove for hours that afternoon, through towns with names I'd forgotten and gas stations that smelled like burnt coffee and stale popcorn, until I ended up parked in front of a lake I didn't recognize. I rolled the windows down, let the breeze push through the car like it might take some of the bitterness with it, and scrolled through my contacts. Sarah's name stared back at me. I almost didn't open it. But curiosity and old habits are hard to kill. Her message was waiting. You should have stayed for dessert. He was gonna toast you too. Right. The old "you left too early" excuse. As if they weren't perfectly content letting me wash dishes while everyone else toasted each other and took selfies for Facebook. As if they had any intention of remembering me at all if I hadn't quietly exited the way I always did, unnoticed and unappreciated. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't come out petty or angry or worse, honest. But that evening, just as I pulled into a diner parking lot to get something that resembled dinner, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voice message from my mother. Her voice was trembling, a low, broken version of itself I hadn't heard in years, not since she was first diagnosed, and we spent night after night lying side by side on her hospital bed while I read her old magazines and pretended not to be terrified. She said my name, softly at first, like it might hurt her to speak it. "I kept it for you all these years," she whispered, breath catching like she was holding back a sob. "I didn't know it still mattered. You were supposed to find it." The message ended there. No explanation. No context. Just those few sentences, soaked in regret and mystery and something else I couldn't place. Maybe guilt, maybe fear, maybe love that had nowhere else to go. I played it 3 times before I put the phone down, each time trying to decode what exactly she meant by it, what I was supposed to find, and why the woman who barely acknowledged my existence at family dinners was now crying because I left early. I didn't eat that night. I just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel like it could anchor me to something solid. My mind was racing through every drawer, every attic box, every basement shelf back home that I hadn't thought about in years. What could she have kept? What would she have hidden that was meant for me? Something from my childhood? A letter? A truth they'd buried because they thought I couldn't handle it? Or worse, something they never meant for me to see, but couldn't throw away. The thing is, I had no idea what I was driving back toward. But something inside me, something old and instinctual, told me I needed to go. Not because I cared about their feelings or because I thought there was still a place for me in that house. No, I needed to go because in that single voicemail, my mother had admitted something that had never passed her lips before: I mattered. At least a little. At least enough to keep something hidden all these years and hope I'd find it. So I turned the car around. No dramatic music, no life-changing revelation, just a quiet, determined shift. I wasn't going back for them. I was going back for me. And whatever the hell I left behind. The house looked smaller than I remembered, as if the weight of time had compressed it from the outside in, like a lung that had forgotten how to expand. And yet the moment I stepped out of the car and felt the crunch of the gravel beneath my feet, that familiar shiver ran up my spine, not from the cold or the wind or even the ghosts of childhood, but from the kind of silence that waits for you, stretches across years, and meets you at the door like it's been holding its breath. I hadn't planned on walking in unannounced, but the thought of calling ahead felt too much like asking permission to reclaim something that might never have been mine in the first place. Besides, I knew the house well enough to know that around this hour, Mom would be at her weekly church group, where she prayed for things she never said out loud, and Dad, if he wasn't dozing in front of the TV, was most likely tinkering in the garage, pretending to be busy while avoiding anything that required emotional labor. The door was unlocked, just like always, the lock more symbolic than functional in a neighborhood where everyone still left Christmas cards on each other's porches and no one ever really asked questions unless gossip was on the line. I stepped into the hallway and was hit with that same thick cocktail of furniture polish, pot roast, and something distinctly antique, the smell of a life too carefully preserved. The wallpaper was the same, the photos on the wall untouched, frames hanging slightly crooked in the same way they had for decades, like the house itself had given up on trying to look perfect. The sound of my footsteps on the hardwood echoed louder than I remembered, every creak and groan under my boots like a memory being stirred awake. I didn't hesitate or tiptoe, and I didn't bother calling out their names. I wasn't there to talk. I was there to find whatever it was I had left behind, and some part of me, deep in my gut, knew it wasn't in a drawer or closet or under a bed. It would be somewhere untouched, somewhere forgotten by everyone except the one who had hidden it, carefully, intentionally, for reasons I hadn't yet begun to understand. The attic was the only place that made sense. It was the one space in the house that had always belonged to the past, a place no one went unless they were searching for something they didn't know they needed. And I hadn't been up there since the winter I was 17 and trying to hide my journals from my sister's prying eyes. The attic stairs, still narrow and mean-spirited, groaned under my weight as I climbed, each step a soft thread of collapse, and when I reached the top and pushed the door open, the smell hit me first: dry paper, old fabric, dust warmed by forgotten summers. And then the light, thin and watery, streaming through the tiny window like a secret trying to squeeze its way into the room. I stood there for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust, scanning boxes with faded labels, mismatched furniture draped in yellowing sheets, holiday decorations long since out of fashion, and stacks of things that once must have mattered to someone. I didn't know what I was looking for, not exactly, but I knew I'd know it when I saw it, because the kind of thing someone keeps for decades, but never speaks about, always has a particular presence. An energy that vibrates in your ribs before your eyes even land on it. It was in the corner, underneath a folded quilt and a stack of ancient magazines that smelled like rain. A box. Not large, not dramatic, just a small, square cardboard box with one word written in faded black ink across the top, Amanda. Not in block letters, not typed handwritten, careful and soft, the kind of handwriting my mother used when she labeled homemade jams or wrote birthday cards before she started forgetting how to spell certain words. My breath caught, not because I found it, but because something inside me had known it would be there. I knelt slowly, not wanting to disturb the moment, not wanting to wake anything I wasn't ready to face, and lifted the lid. Inside, carefully arranged and cushioned by layers of tissue paper, were fragments of a life I hadn't realized someone had chosen to remember. A small, beaded bracelet, pink and blue, the elastic stretched thin, one I had made in kindergarten, presented proudly to my mother as if I were gifting her a crown. A laminated copy of my first short story, the one about the fox who couldn't find his home, complete with grammatical errors and backward letters, preserved like it had mattered more than it ever seemed to. A photo of me sitting beside my mother in the hospital, holding her hand while pretending to be brave. I was maybe 14, and I remember feeling like if I looked scared, she'd fall apart. And then under those layers, at the very bottom of the box, was a letter. Yellowed with time, sealed but unaddressed, the flap just tucked inside, not glued. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. I unfolded the letter with fingers that didn't feel like mine and read slowly, as if rushing might break something sacred. The words were tender, aching, and soaked in contradictions, an apology for not being able to love me the way she thought I needed, an admission of her own fears and failures, a confession that for years she had measured me against an invisible scale that had nothing to do with who I was, but with who she had been before me. You stayed, she wrote, and I punished you for it because staying meant you saw everything. And that terrified me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And yet I wasn't finished. Beneath the letter was one more item, a document. A certificate. At first, I thought it was mine, just misplaced. But the name caught me. Amanda Rose. My full name. Same spelling, same middle name. But the date was wrong. The birth date was 2 years before mine. And then I saw it, infant death certificate. My hands began to shake. Mother, Ellen Louise. Father, unknown. The box tilted slightly in my lap, but I didn't notice. I was too busy staring at something I couldn't unsee, holding proof that I had never been the first Amanda, that there had been another. A version before me. One they buried, but never let go of. One they replaced. And suddenly I understood. I wasn't their miracle. I was their substitute. It took me the better part of an hour to leave that attic, and even longer to convince my legs to carry me back down the stairs without crumbling beneath the weight of what I now knew, though knew is too clean a word, too rational. Too polite for the storm that had begun twisting through my insides with a force that felt older than memory and sharper than betrayal, because it wasn't just the shock of discovering the existence of a child who came before me, a child with my name and my mother's blood and no listed father, but the slow, inevitable realization that everything, every distant glance, every moment of withdrawal, every cruel silence and awkward praise directed toward the others and never to me, suddenly made a kind of twisted sense, as if I had spent my entire life auditioning for a role that had already been cast and closed, a role I could never truly fill, no matter how hard I tried to be useful, quiet, dependable, and available at the expense of everything I was or wanted to be. The house seemed even quieter now, not just empty of people but of illusions, of safe lies, of all the ways I had tricked myself into believing that the things they failed to say didn't matter, that the omissions weren't personal, That my role in this family had simply evolved into something less visible, something respectable in its quiet resilience. But standing there in the hallway with that death certificate pressed to my chest like a second skin, I felt like an imposter in a life I hadn't chosen, a placeholder for grief, a body that had been born not out of love but out of loss. And whether anyone would ever admit it out loud or not, I had been raised in the shadow of a child who never breathed long enough to disappoint them, whose memory had been stitched into the fabric of our family so subtly that it had never even occurred to me that I was chasing a ghost that looked exactly like me. I found my mother in the sunroom, exactly where I expected she would be, seated in her favorite chair by the window, a teacup resting delicately between her fingers, half full of chamomile and half cold. Her gaze fixed on the bird feeder outside like it held the answers to questions she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. She didn't turn when I entered. She didn't flinch when I laid the certificate on the table beside her cup. She just looked at it, slowly, like she already knew what it was, like she had been expecting it to surface sooner or later, and now that it had, she seemed neither relieved nor afraid, just exhausted. "I wasn't going to hide it from you forever," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the ticking of the wall clock and the soft chirping of the birds she fed religiously every morning. "But I didn't think you'd find it like this. I thought maybe I'd have the courage to tell you one day, when the time was right, when it wouldn't hurt so much. But I suppose there's no such thing as a painless truth." I didn't respond immediately, because how do you respond to something that reshapes the entire architecture of your identity, that redefines your very existence, not as a beginning, but as a continuation, not as an individual, but as an echo? So I sat across from her and let the silence stretch between us until it began to creak under the strain of everything we hadn't said over the years, the tightrope tension of mother and daughter who had never quite managed to meet in the middle. "She was mine," she said finally, her eyes still fixed outside, as if speaking directly to the squirrels and cardinals would make it less unbearable. "She was mine, and she was gone before I could even hold her long enough to say goodbye. I was barely 20, alone, scared, and ashamed. My parents told me not to name her. They said it would be easier that way. But I did. I named her Amanda. It was the only thing I could give her." I remember my throat tightening as I listened, not just because of what she had suffered, but because of what that name meant to me now, the idea that I had been given a second-hand identity, a borrowed name from a girl who never got to live, a symbol more than a daughter. And yet, I wasn't angry. Not in that moment. I was something else entirely. I was hollow. "And me?" I asked, my voice flat, but not cold. "What was I?" She turned to face me then, and for the first time in what felt like decades, I saw her not as my mother, not even as a woman I had spent most of my life resenting in quiet, painful doses, but as a human being cracked in half by grief, held together by routines and silence and the myth that time heals. Her eyes, ringed in red and years, were glassy but direct. "You were a gift I didn't deserve," she said. "But I didn't know how to love you without feeling like I was betraying her." The honesty in that moment, raw and stripped of all pretense, cut deeper than any lie ever could, because it was not cruel, and it was not vindictive, it was simply the truth. Spoken out loud after too many years of being buried under casseroles and polite conversation. She had loved me, in her way, but her way had always been distorted by the guilt of surviving one daughter just to raise another with the same name, and somewhere along the line, she had convinced herself that I could carry both burdens, her grief and my own, without cracking. I stood up without saying anything else, not out of spite or rage, but because I needed space to breathe, to understand who I was now that the foundation I had built myself upon had shifted. I walked out of the sunroom, down the hallway, past the living room still littered with decorations from the party, and into the foyer, where my father stood like a statue near the coat rack, watching me with an expression that made my skin crawl. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded once, as if we both knew this wasn't over. But instead of heading toward the front door, I turned and made my way to the garage, where I found a stack of unopened boxes from my brother's last move, things he hadn't bothered to pick up, things no one else had touched. I picked out the one labeled Photos and Personal, tucked it under my arm, and walked out without explanation. Because if my mother had spent her life burying one truth, I had a feeling Mark had buried another, and I wasn't done digging. There's something uniquely suffocating about realizing that the role you've played for most of your life, the quiet one, the helper, the daughter who never needed much, and therefore never received much, was not just a misunderstanding or a byproduct of family dynamics, but a deliberate casting, a strategic placement in the background so the spotlight could continue to shine undisturbed on the golden children, the ones who never showed up for the ugly parts of life, but always arrived just in time for the applause. And once you see it clearly, once the veil lifts and the lines on the family portrait begin to blur, it becomes impossible to keep pretending that everything was done in good faith, or that the injustice was accidental. No, it was curated carefully, habitually, over years, and in that realization, something hardened in me, not rage exactly, but a clarity so sharp it could cut through bone. I didn't return to my apartment right away. I didn't text anyone. I didn't cry. I drove across town, heart pounding with a quiet, simmering focus, until I reached the neighborhood where my brother lived, the kind of sanitized suburb where every lawn is aggressively trimmed and every driveway tells a lie about happiness. I parked on the street, grabbed the box I had taken from our parents' garage, the one labeled Photos and Personal, and walked up to the door like someone on a mission that could no longer be postponed. His wife, Rachel, answered, her smile as automatic as the air conditioning humming behind her, but it faltered when she saw my face, because even though we'd never been close, she recognized the expression I wore. That terrifying calm that comes only when someone has decided they're done being polite. "Can we talk?" I asked, and she stepped aside without speaking, letting me in like she somehow knew that whatever was about to happen would shift the floor beneath both of us. I didn't bother with small talk or explanations. I placed the box on their pristine kitchen counter, opened the lid, and pulled out the photos, vacation snapshots, baby pictures, family events, all carefully preserved, untouched for years, dustless in their nostalgia. I pulled out the envelope I had found at the bottom, the one marked legal, and handed it to her with hands that didn't shake. Inside were documents I had stumbled on only because I was searching for answers to a different question, but the truth they revealed was a gift too cruel to ignore, proof of a financial account in Rachel's name that she hadn't opened, tied to transfers from an LLC registered under my brother's name, money funneled from an insurance policy they had collected after an accident I'd barely remembered. Rachel stared at the papers, flipping through them with growing horror, and then looked up at me, her voice barely more than a breath. "What is this?" "It's the reason your husband has 3 storage units under false names. It's why he's always traveling for conferences. And it's why you've been getting those anonymous texts you thought were spam. He's been laundering money through side projects, but not very well. And one of those projects is about to fall apart." I left her standing there, stunned and pale, and walked out before I could be asked for more. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't even revenge in the traditional sense. It was a correction, a balancing of scales that had been tipped so long in the wrong direction that they didn't even recognize gravity anymore. I didn't do it to destroy his marriage or to ruin his image. I did it because he was never held accountable, not when he disappeared during Mom's cancer treatments, not when he skipped Dad's hospitalization because he had meetings, not when he lied to our faces and was rewarded with trust. Someone had to stop pretending he was the hero, and it wasn't going to be the woman still clinging to illusions. So I did it. But I wasn't finished. 2 days later, I drove to Sarah's house, which felt less like a home and more like a magazine cover, staged, sterile, every corner curated to project the image of a woman who had everything under control. I rang the bell, and when she opened the door, her smile didn't even have time to form before I handed her a printed email, one she had sent 13 years ago from an account she thought was long deleted. An email she had written to a man she had met at a conference in New Orleans, a man who was not her husband, but who had, for a brief 6-month window, rented a hotel room in her name every other Thursday. She scanned the paper with a look I'd never seen on her face before, not guilt exactly, but recognition, like something she'd buried had finally caught up and tapped her on the shoulder. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, not because she was afraid of me, but because she was afraid of herself, of what she might have to admit if she kept reading. "I didn't come here to shame you," I said, my voice flat but honest. "I came to make sure you know the next time you point a finger at me for being too cold, or too selfish, or too distant, I know exactly what your warmth cost." I walked away before she could answer. My final move wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It didn't come with fireworks or screaming matches or any of the catharsis I had once imagined it might. No, it was quieter than that, more devastating in its simplicity. I wrote a toast. Not for a wedding. Not for a celebration. But for the truth. I wrote it down, word by word, then posted it to my social media, where all the cousins and distant aunts and family friends, the ones who had smiled at me while whispering to each other that I was always a little off, could read it. To the forgotten child, the one who stayed behind when others fled, the one who held her mother's hand in the dark and carried the silence of a house too heavy to speak, here's to the child who was never toasted, never praised, never spotlighted, but who finally, after all these years, decided she didn't need anyone's permission to exist. I didn't check the comments. I didn't respond to messages. I turned off the notifications, packed a bag, and drove toward the coast, away from the noise, away from the narratives that had tried to claim me. It was sunrise when I stepped out onto the beach, the wind strong, the waves louder than I expected, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't performing. I wasn't healing. I wasn't even hurting. I was just present. Not for them. Not for the image. But for myself. Later, sitting in a folding chair with my feet buried in the cool sand, I opened my phone one last time, not out of weakness, but out of curiosity. There was one message from my mother, timestamped at 2 a.m. I told the truth. "You were never second. You were what kept me alive." I stared at it for a long moment, the words swimming in the early morning light, and then, without bitterness, without anger, I simply deleted it. Because sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't confrontation. Sometimes it isn't vindication. Sometimes it's silence. And sometimes, silence is the loudest thing in the room.